Thank you guys so much for having me. This is really a privilege and an honor, and I'm so happy to be here. And I promise you, I am not going to bore you with a long presentation right before Lupe Fiasco comes out. I know that's what you guys are waiting for. I love him too. But today is going to be all about what disability means and what it may mean to you, even if you're not disabled and even if you don't identify as disabled. One of the things I love to say is I never thought in a million years that I'd end up disabled. I grew up a healthy kid and then boom, 9 years old, I get diagnosed with a heart condition. Year and a half later, I'm on an operating table getting a heart and kidney transplant. Disability can happen to anyone at any time. It's not an indication of karma. It's not because you're a bad person. But the reality is, we all may very well become disabled one day. So it's important to listen and learn from our community as disabled people, just so you know what it means to be us when you become us. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and start the presentation now. So welcome to Ujima Wednesdays. And what we're gonna do today is discuss disability politics and policy and who am I? Because that's something I've struggled with and many other people in my position have as well. So as you can see, image description, Black woman in a wheelchair. I'm wearing a yellow dress. My hair is long and curly. Often in the disabled community, we do image descriptions for people who can't see or who are low vision. So it's important to know that even if you have a disability, you are still included and people can still envision what you look like. I'm a Black disabled woman with a story to tell, and I hope you enjoy it. So one of the questions I always get asked is, were you born that way? Now, this is a funny image of someone, as a woman who's pregnant, and her sonogram with the little person, with a little fetus tied up and plugged into a electric socket. So no, every disabled person was not born that way. This is the one identity you don't have to be born into. And number one, I didn't expect to become a wheelchair user, and I became a wheelchair user at age 20. The reality is 93% of people with disabilities don't use a wheelchair at all. So when you think of disability, don't always think of blind, deaf, cane, crutches, whatever, service dog, whatever. Disability has many faces, and it's not just one image. And disability is an identity. I'm a Black woman. Being a woman is a part of my identity. It's shaped my experiences on this earth. Being Black has shaped my experiences on this earth. So why is it that I am allowed to be proud to be a Black woman, but I'm not allowed to be proud to be disabled? Why is it something that we should be expected to hide or that we should shield others from? Because disability isn't a negative attribute. It's an identity a lot of us take pride in. We have our own distinct culture, solidarity, and common connection and a unifying experience. As a Black person, Ebonics was the phrase at one point, and now it's African American Vernacular English, AAVE, and it's studied by linguists and has been studied since slave journals about Black diction and the way that we talk. Even amongst disabled people, we have our own language. We have things like crip theory, crip identity. You know, crip is a controversial phrase within the community, but we have our own slang. One of my mentors was quoted in the Washington Post, and she said, "It's hard out here for a crip." I thought it was the funniest thing I'd ever heard. But that's our community. We have our own language. We have our own unique culture where we understand each other and what we go through. We joke about how we get stared at wherever we go because people just aren't used to seeing disabled people out having a social life or working. I get congratulated for having a full-time job, and I'm like, same to you. Working is not a miracle. Having a job, having an education as a disabled person is not a miracle. We are not here to inspire you. We're here existing as your equals. So here's a little bit of a story about me, and give you a little face to what disability used to look like. This is me and my brothers on their 10th birthday. We're in traditional Nigerian attire. I'm in the middle, they're twins, and it's their 10th birthday. And in our culture, it's like a bar mitzvah. 10th birthday is when you essentially become a man. I become an adult, I become a woman. And at this time, my family didn't know that I had a heart condition. Um, we still don't know what happened that influenced me to have a genetic heart condition. My parents thought it was just asthma that made me so tired all the time. And that was a cultural barrier in understanding the American system of medical care. How I discovered that I was disabled was I passed out at a overnight school field trip called Camp Schmidt. And I had previously, my parents, a lot of immigrants, we go through economic changes, economic mobility. So I moved from going to the poorest elementary school in the county, Prince George's County, to going to a, lower middle class area. And things were expected of me that were different. My school said, this isn't normal. You guys have to get her checked out. And they come to find out that I have a unique heart condition and everything spins out of control in less than a year. And they tell me I have heart failure. They tell me I have kidney failure. And all of a sudden, I have three rare diseases in addition to that. And I went from this normal kid with just asthma to I'm in and out the hospital all the time. And so I had to learn how to advocate for myself. I didn't become a wheelchair user till I was 20. And given the school that I went to in high school, I went to a high school called High Point, aka Knife Point, aka Gunpoint. Though I didn't look disabled because I was walking, I was 3 years out of having a heart and kidney transplant. But to the average person, they think a transplant means you're fixed, nothing's wrong with you anymore. And that's not true. You're on medication for life, and it can even cause you to have cancer, which I developed. One of the administrators at my school physically pushed me out of the elevator because I didn't look like I needed it. I go home, I tell my parents, well, the school says the rule is you can't use the elevator. And I said, we have accommodations. We have doctor's notes. And my parents didn't know what to do. So I had to figure out how to navigate the legal system and discover what the Americans with Disabilities Act was. I had a wonderful student government teacher who helped me write a letter to the school board. And the school board called my guidance counselor and screamed their head off. And I get a call from the office and they go, Ola, here's your key, but did you have to go to the school board? And that was my first taste of politics. That was my first taste of, I don't have to go through this. I can stand up for myself and there are laws to protect me. But those intersectional barriers of being a first generation American and not having parents who know the system, having to stand up in front of the school board with my peers and give speeches and tell them about the deteriorating school system, our tattered textbooks, that was my freedom. That was my empowerment. That made me feel less helpless as a disabled student. But I got to wrap this up. I'm sorry. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to try and get to the nitty-gritty and get to the good parts. Why should this matter to you? This is one of my faves. Her name is Imani Barbara. You can follow her on TikTok. She's very famous. One of her quotes that really touched me is Black, Indigenous, and disabled people of color experience the world at intersections of racism and ableism. And no matter how comfortable it is to hear, we as a community must listen to validate these experiences. As I've said before, I am you and you are me. Everyone will become disabled at one point in their life. If you plan on living to old age, there are very few 80-year-olds who are running 5Ks. There are very few 80-year-olds that aren't seeing the doctor on a regular basis. This will eventually hit you, and you want to be able to have the same access, the same rights that you have now as a person who is temporarily able-bodied. As we said, this will not be your average everyday presentation, but it's going to be a real conversation. So let's start with our first activity. This is confidential and a safe space. You can answer these questions silently and to yourself. Yes or no. And just remember, you can answer to yourself. You don't have to put anything in the chat. Do you ever feel so sad or despondent that it's challenging to get out of bed? Do you have a common medical condition like diabetes, asthma, or high blood pressure? Do you have chronic pain in parts of your body that it's so painful it's hard for you to focus at your job or at work or at school? Do you hide any rashes or skin issues with your clothes or with makeup? Do you plan ahead of time to conceal difficulties you have compared to your peers? So I'm what you call an ambulatory wheelchair user. There are many wheelchair users who can walk, and we use our wheelchairs for distance. So one of the ways I've hidden my disability out of denial was going to job interviews and not taking my wheelchair and struggling with walking and trying to mask how out of breath I was just so I could assimilate. So that's what I mean by, do you plan ahead of time to conceal your difficulties compared to other people? Answer yes or no just to yourself. Have you ever been afraid to ask for time off due to health issues? Do you fear asking for any type of accommodation, whether you're in school or at your job? Meaning, have you been afraid to ask to work from home because you're not feeling good? Have you been afraid to ask for extra time on an assignment? Like, do you conceal your medical condition out of worry that it'll keep you from a promotion, or it'll hurt your career, or it'll hurt your business, or it'll lead to a firing, or, it'll lead to a poor grade? Like, do you privately take medication at your work or your house and don't tell anyone you're taking it? A lot of people with mental illness don't let their families know that they're taking medication for depression or bipolar disorder out of shame. Do you have a medical condition that you're afraid your coworkers or friends will ever find out about and that they'll judge you harshly for it? So I'm going to give you about 2 minutes, or I'm sorry, 30 seconds to think about if you responded yes to any of these questions. If you responded yes, you might just be disabled, and that's not a bad thing. If you have to hide, then disability applies. Disability is a broad term that includes more than just wheelchairs, crutches, walkers, prosthetics, or mobility devices, or being an amputee. Literally, asthma is considered a disability because it kills thousands of people every year. Even food allergies are considered a disability because there are kids who have to literally eat at a separate lunch table in their schools for fear that any contact with an allergen will send them into anaphylactic shock and kill them. Those are disabilities. But since we associate disability with pity, we see anything that's common. Oh, they're not disabled. I don't feel sorry for them because that's common. That's something everyone deals with. Well, no, that's not how disability works. Not every disability is visible, and not every disability has to meet the standard of pity in the eyes of ableist people. Under the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, things like vitiligo, diabetes, asthma, even cosmetic disfigurements are considered disabilities. And ableism is why people don't consider those conditions disabilities, due to the misconception that disability means complete inability or victimhood. And we are not victims. Mental health conditions are the leading cause of disability, and chronic illnesses count as disabilities. Myth. There's this long withstanding myth that what is legally a disability is what you can get Social Security benefits for. And no, the government does not decide what we are as disabled people, and a check does not determine whether you are truly disabled. Disabled does not mean you cannot work. There are 18.6 million disabled people who are employed. So that disability means you can't have a job and you have to get, no, that doesn't work. That doesn't apply to us. So these are just some of the many faces of disability. As you can see at the bottom, that's Tammy Duckworth. She's a US Senator. She's also an amputee, and she's a war veteran. You see Peter Dinklage, the actor from Game of Thrones. He has a disability called dwarfism. People believe dwarfism is just being short. No, it comes with very serious medical conditions. And many people with dwarfism have to have surgeries. They deal with chronic pain. They deal with a number of ailments in addition to just being short of stature. Winnie Harlow, who's a model, she has vitiligo. That is considered a disability. And Serena Williams has a hidden disability. She has Sjogren's syndrome, and she talks about having professional tennis taken away from her as a result of having Sjogren's syndrome and dealing with the symptoms and struggling to get a diagnosis, like many Black women have. Black women continue to struggle to be diagnosed with many disabilities because we aren't believed in the medical exam room. So again, Venus Williams has an autoimmune disease, and her quote directly is, "I literally had professional tennis taken away from me before I got the right diagnosis." So she did take some time off of tennis due to her illness. Let's discuss what ableism is. It's discrimination and prejudice against people with disabilities. You know, people define us as inferior, and non-disabled people as superior. And that is not the case. We have so many history makers who are people with disabilities that who just don't feel comfortable coming out of the closet. Intersectionality, all oppression is connected. It just means discrimination and domination is connected based on multiple identities, whether it's race, ethnicity, disability, gender, or sexuality, or sexual identity, or class. For example, I'm a wheelchair user. People think I don't have privilege. I have a boatload of privilege. I'm employed. I have a bachelor's degree. You know, I have things a lot of people in my community do not have that allows me to live a life that where I'm not entrapped in poverty. But you know, we're all just, you know, one hop skipping away from being homeless. But the reality is I am privileged because I am a first generation American. You know, I have an education and I am employed at the moment. I have health insurance. I'm not reliant right now. This can change at any moment. I'm not relying on public assistance. And there's nothing wrong with public assistance. Those things are needed to keep my community alive. But the reality is, I have a boatload of privilege, and a disability doesn't erase that. I'll just give you an example of one of the heinous acts of ableism I've experienced. At the White House, I got my wheelchair because I wanted to work in politics. I studied government at the University of Maryland, College Park. And I got the internship of a lifetime to intern in the White House, and I could not do it while walking, meaning I had to get a professional scooter because my walking distance as a heart transplant patient and someone with rare disease was a block. And in the White House and on Capitol Hill, you are walking everywhere. I actually had to go to the Nike store to get somebody shorts to play basketball with President Obama. And I could not do that. I could not do that with a disability. And so at the time, I spoke with my doctors. I got the motorized scooter, and a white staffer at the White House pulled up to me towards the last days of my internship. You know, it was the last day for all of us. People were drinking, and he sat in my wheelchair, brought it to me, and told me, I brought you your wheelchair, even though you don't really need it. This is the most heinous. This person is the son of an elected official. This person is the CEO of a major nonprofit right now. I will not say their name, but this is not out of the ordinary for people with disabilities. Just know that. And know that this is happening to certain types of people with disabilities. A white girl who had a double organ transplant, whose staffers, whose supervisors were informed of this, would not have had this happen to them. When I was in high school and I was physically pushed out of an elevator by an administrator, that does not happen to girls of a certain hue who have a disability. This is how race, disability, and class intersect. And just so y'all know, I did get to meet President Obama years after my internship. And y'all, when he touched my hands, I don't know what type of lotion he used, but he wasn't ashy at all. He had the softest hands. He was sweet. It was the best day of my life, aside from my organ transplant anniversary. You know, I saved my life. But yeah, that was great. So racism and ableism, you know, disability and race create a unique experience for POCs with disabilities. You know, this accounts for higher unemployment, poverty, discrimination, and often dropping out of school. And this is true for Black people within their history because being Black does subject you to greater forms of medical racism and environmental racism that causes disability. So, for example, my transplant hospital, the hospital I go to get care, um, Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, it's named after an enslaver. I used to be treated at Hopkins Kennedy Krieger Institute, and I'd like you to Google the Kennedy Krieger experiment on low income Black children in Baltimore. And the hospital conducted medical experiments on Black children. And this was in the 80s and 90s. I was born in the 90s. So this wasn't that long ago. And this is how it works for us. This is what race and disability works looks like. Ableism experience in the workplace number 2. Former supervisor. His mom was disabled. His mom had cancer his entire life. And back then they didn't speak about it. and I'm sitting in my wheelchair at my job. This is a previous job, not the one I have now, but we're talking and he says, "You're not disabled." And my response was, "That's not for you to decide." I've spent my entire life prior to becoming a not my entire life, but much of my education trying to prove to people that I was disabled before I got my wheelchair. Because when you don't look like you have a disability, it's easy for people to erode and deny you what you're entitled to. So I told him that's not for you to decide. There are so many disabled people who have hidden disabilities who don't get, who are mistreated and who are discriminated against because they don't look like they have a disability. And I live on both sides of the coin because I can walk and I use a wheelchair. I know how people treat me when I'm standing as opposed to when I'm sitting. Not to say that people with visible disabilities have it easy. It's not a competition of who has it worse, but just know it's no one's ability for them to decide what you are. I know who I am. What's wrong with being disabled? And that is the question I want everyone to ask themselves. If you were in front of a person with a disability and they ask you what's wrong with being disabled, what would you say? Exactly. You got to challenge the self-hate that disabled, mentally ill, or chronically ill people have been taught, that there's something wrong with us. No, there's a whole lot right with you. And the woman in this photo, her name is Claudia Gordon. Claudia Gordon is the first Black deaf woman attorney in the United States. The woman in this photo. And you can see that she is wearing a Black Disabled Women Matter shirt. And that shirt is from the business that I started. I started a shop called Ola's Truth Boutique, and we sell disability pride apparel. It says that there's nothing wrong with who we are and that we matter too. Because Black disabled women deal with the onslaught of racism, sexism, the triple headed monster called ableism too. And Claudia also is a model in real life. She had a billboard in Times Square and she modeled for Tommy Hilfiger. So stop the stigma. There's nothing wrong with using the word disabled. You don't have to avoid it with weird phrases like differently abled, handicapable, or handicapped. This ain't nothing to be ashamed of, and the language should reflect that. Everyone has their own process. It took me years. I had a disability accommodation 504 plan, and I was still in denial about being disabled in high school, and parts of college. And not everyone's comfortable identifying as disabled, and that's okay. We all have a process and time to come to terms with our identity. If you're more comfortable using language like accommodations, chronic illness, medical condition, that works too. Know your rights. There's a reason that there's this push not to identify as disabled, and that somehow you're giving up by identifying as disabled. People can deny you your rights the minute you say you're not disabled. There is no Differently Abled Americans Act, Handicapable Americans Act. You are going to continue to have your rights and your freedoms denied. Who are you going to sue if you're discriminated against in employment, or if you're discriminated against by the police because of your disability? Are you File a lawsuit on the basis of what? File a complaint on the basis of what? You have to put disability. So denying who you are, it only leads to more of an erosion of your rights. So there's so many benefits to being disabled, in my opinion. When I was younger, you could get tuition waivers for college in the state of Maryland. There are affirmative action programs based on increasing disability hiring, business loans. You can get certified as a disabled business owner and qualify for grants. You can have non-competitive hiring in the U.S. federal government. A status as a disabled business owner opens you up to so much. Even when I was in college, they had student loan forgiveness under the Obama administration. If you had a disability, you continue to not identify as disabled, you are missing out. The disability rights movement, there was a whole movement to grant us the rights that we have today. And for me, it's a slap in the face to benefit from the labor of these disabled people who died trying to get the rights that I enjoy today by being ashamed to call myself disabled. I'm proud of who I am and my disability history. The validity of a disability is not determined by what you see. Know that hidden disabilities are just as valid as visible ones. Don't ever let someone discount your experience. This is my greatest fear, and the fear of bias. As you can see in one photo, I'm standing up, and you can see in the other, I'm sitting down um, in my wheelchair. In 2012, I refused to be photographed by Glamour magazine seated in my wheelchair in front of the Capitol building. I'd been named the top 10 most influential college women in the United States by Glamour, and they wanted that picture, but I did not want people to be able to see me in that state. I didn't want people to look at me and see weakness. I was like, what if someone Googles this and they real and I'm trying to apply for something and they discriminate against me because now my disability is visible. Eventually I came out of that and finally said, hey, I'm gonna be okay with who I am. And it was my biggest regret, not not sitting in my wheelchair for that Glamour photo shoot, because it could have meant a lot to a lot of young disabled girls and women. You know, your disability is your business. No one has to know. That's just how it is. And that's how I felt for a long time. And it is inappropriate to ask what someone's disability is. However, are you tired? This serious question. Are you tired of running or living in fear? You add hardship by concealing your disability. When I began revealing my disability and choosing to become an ambulatory wheelchair user, initially it was hard. I chose it. I was like, I could be sick forever and never walk anywhere and stay trapped in my house. Or I could go out and get a career for myself by becoming a wheelchair user. And that's the choice that I made. It was hard and it was liberating. And you know, I love me some Beyonce. This was freedom for me. I've realized my wheelchair gave me freedom. I was able to travel to different countries because I was not contingent on a one block walking radius. You know, I didn't associate accommodations with special treatment. I didn't feel like suffering in silence. That made me a hero. You know, I walked all day and I can't walk tomorrow. I'm a real hero. No, there's nothing heroic about denying your disability and wanting to be just like everyone else and suffering in silence. None of that is an achievement. It never will be. Our liberation as disabled people comes with normalizing disability. We are the largest minority group in this country, disabled people. There are 1.3 billion of us in this world. Who's going to tell us we're not normal? I dare them. Tell me I'm not normal. I wish you would. The LGBT community and the disabled community have so many things in common. When you look at disability history, there are a lot of queer people involved in our liberation. And one thing we have in common is having to come out the closet. Do I tell people I'm disabled? Do I not? On the apps, dating apps, do I inform my employer during an interview that I'm disabled in this application for this job or this application for this program or application for whatever? Do I come out of the closet? And I think it's time for us to come out of the closet, but it's a choice you have to make. And now we're at this, we are, unfortunately, I know we're running out of time, but we're going to get to, you know, Developmental Disability Awareness Month and how it impacts all of us. It was created to remove barriers and advance inclusion and create social integration through removing barriers. I don't know if any of you have heard of this young man who was killed by the police. He was an autistic 15-year-old young boy killed by the police this Saturday for having a garden tool and appearing threatening. His name is Ryan Gaynor, and he's autistic, and autism is a developmental disability. It is not an intellectual disability. He was killed on Saturday, and he joins the 50% of people killed by the police who are disabled. That's right. 50% of people killed by the police are disabled. And this is a statistic from the Ruderman Foundation, which is a Jewish led nonprofit. So, this was an unbiased study based on police data. And it's very valid that this is a problem. The police have no problem killing people with disabilities because they don't see them as people. There's a special education to prison pipeline. We talk about the school to prison pipeline, but what about the special education to prison pipeline? You know, if 85% of kids who were incarcerated as youth in juvenile detention were diagnosed with a disability. We have a generation of young, disabled, and incarcerated people. In my area, I live in the DC metro area. In Montgomery County, there was a bill being suggested earlier this year that the police be given a listing of people with disabilities in the Montgomery County area to keep them safe. No, this was this was intentionally created for the police to have a list of people whom the community feels like they need to be protected from. This was targeted and it was discriminatory. Freddie Gray is another example of someone with a developmental disability. He was killed by the Baltimore police. I was actually there during the riots when the National Guard was there, and it was highly exaggerated. It was not a riot. I would say it was an uprising. And he was diagnosed with a developmental disability due to lead poisoning. He and his sister both experienced lead poisoning, low income housing in Baltimore City. And lead poisoning has been a problem in Black neighborhoods and Black urban cities for years. And it has an effect on Black children. Freddie Gray's mother eventually sued the apartment complex, but it didn't mean the damage wasn't done. This is an actual scan of Freddie Gray's brain where you can see the highlighted areas of where the lead poisoning affected him. These are pictures of Freddie Gray as a child as well. And you can see some of the lead paint chipping off of the walls. You know, a child who has been poisoned by lead is 7 times more likely to drop out of high school and 6 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. And this was true for Freddie Gray. He ended up dropping out of high school and he did end up having a criminal record. But that doesn't mean his death is justifiable. Disability justice is a new way to look at, I would say disability rights and disability justice are two separate things. And disability justice fully encompasses the needs of all people with disabilities. The disability rights movement was very whitewashed. It, it very much ignored the contributions of Black disabled leaders to the movement. But disability justice challenges that by examining disability and ableism as they relate to other forms of oppression like race, class, and gender. For example, the famous 504 sit-ins, I'm sorry, in the 1970s, let me backtrack. I'm sorry. There is a famous Black Panther by the name of Brad Lomax, and the Black Panther Party assisted the disability rights movement during the legendary 504 sit-ins when 100 plus disabled people occupied a federal building in San Francisco to demand that the government enforce the 504 section of the Rehabilitation Act. So, that history is often erased from disability rights. So, disability justice is how we incorporate racial justice, gender justice, and economic justice into disability rights. So let's talk. This is going to be a last activity. Um, this is a safe space where you can answer the following questions to yourself. Same rules apply. Have you ever used terms like turn a blind eye, idiot, imbecile, mad, nuts, psycho, spaz, dumb, lame, moron, blind leading the blind, retarded, fallen on deaf ears, crippled, barren, crazy, slow, blind to? Like she's blind to X, Y, and Z. I'm so ADD, bipolar, obsessed with OCD. Now, I'll give you a few seconds to think about if you ever use those phrases. Now, the that language, those were actual medical diagnoses that doctors would diagnose people with. People would be diagnosed as an idiot, as an imbecile, as a moron. And then these people were housed in institutions like this, the Willowbrook Hospital State School in Staten Island. Many people spent much of their lives here from childhood to adulthood. And we use the language so casually in our everyday life. How many times have you called somebody stupid and not realized that was an actual medical diagnosis? Ableism is so common, it's ingrained in our daily language. So, I do want to get to some of the more important parts when it comes to blackness and disability, but this institution is right near my house. It's in Laurel, Maryland. It's called Forest Haven, and it was the most notorious institution for disabled people in terms of violence, neglect, disease, and abuse. They even use fire hoses on children. There were mass spreads of communicable preventative diseases. Kids were tortured, and it wasn't just children, they lived until adulthood. And so there was this couple, Ricardo and Donna Thornton. They actually met in this institution, and they were residents from childhood to early adulthood. There were many deaths at this institution, and they survived. And when they were finally released, they were sent there since they were children because they were considered mentally retarded. That's the diagnosis. They fought for the right to get married, live independently, be employed, and have children as intellectually disabled people. And as you can see in the photos, that's pictures of their marriage maybe 30 plus years ago. And then another photo from the New York Times of them again, and a photo below of them with their son. They got jobs, they had a child, and they did this defying a lot of the rules set by the government because legally they were still wards of the state. They wouldn't let them have things like their own bank accounts because they didn't think that they were capable of managing their own money, let alone having a child. Their child is an adult now. They're grandparents. Their child is extremely bright and intelligent. He took some college courses and he's doing great. And they're retired. And these are the traumas that our community as disabled people went through. It's a history unknown to many. And that has everything to do with having a developmental disability, and this being Developmental Disabilities Month. So there was a movie created about it by Kirstie Alley and Delroy Lindo. The movie was god awful. Most movies about disabled people are, because they never actually choose disabled people to act in them. There are a number of people with disabilities who are actors, who are intellectually disabled, who can play roles about themselves. But this film was terrible. I saw it as a child, and reading the quotes from Kirstie Alley, who was the producer, she said Donna is not a woman you'd feel sorry for her. She's feisty. And I'm like, what disabled person is asking you to feel sorry for them? You're creating this film out of a pity lens. We call it pity porn for a reason. But the movie was just terrible, just bad. But the real life story is beautiful. They continued to lead. Ricardo Thornton, he ended up testifying before Congress about his experiences. And he told Congress that he had a brother in that same facility, and he didn't learn that they were biologically related until they left. That's how dubious the abuse was. That his own family was incarcerated in that facility and he didn't even know. And so these are pictures of them speaking, they're activists, and one of them got to hold the torch of hope with Nelson Mandela in South Africa. All right, we're gonna just wrap up. In terms of parents' rights, they were both parents, and it's still legal in 35 states for disabled people to have their kids taken on the basis of their disability alone. These are some people who are changing the game and myths about disability. Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman, disability is alopecia. Solange Knowles, musician, her disability is an autonomic disorder called PCOS. Haben Girma at the top. She's the first deaf and blind woman to graduate from Harvard Law. Deaf and blind. I say this again. And another picture of Claudia Gordon. She was an advisor at the White House. And again, she's the first deaf Black woman attorney in the US. And these people are changing the game and busting myths about disabilities. These are some of the shirts from my boutique. It says everything that I feel. My disability is my superpower. These are the real models behind it. Some of them are disabled. That's Judy Heumann, Claudia Haben, Liz Plank, who's a famous author. And, be the change you wish to see for future generations. This is a young girl named Jada. She's a stroke survivor. She has one of my shirts on, young, gifted, Black, and disabled. And bonus fact, You guys are gonna see Lupe Fiasco sing, or I'm sorry, you're gonna see Lupe Fiasco speak soon. Recently, Madonna had an incident with a disabled fan where she targeted them and asked them to stand up and why they weren't standing. It was quite disrespectful. But me and Lupe Fiasco have a special connection. He saw me sitting down at a standing room only concert. He was so sweet. He dedicated Superstar to me. He picked me out of the crowd to pick his last song of the night, and we ended up seeing each other. I ended up meeting him backstage. Y'all, he's another one. He's just amazing. But with that being said, I'm glad you guys get to see him speak. And any questions?
Thank you so much. Any questions indeed? And can we get a round of applause online and in person for Ola? Please. So we'd like to prioritize questions for our online audience first. Daya put in the chat, what are some suggestions you have for people who don't receive much support from family?
Ooh, I understand that feeling. I will say, if you're on social media, reach out to Disability Twitter, hashtag Disability Twitter, or if you find some people on social media who are disabled who share your same struggles, reach out to them and message them. I know not all of us are like extroverts. I'm an introvert, but having people that I can tweet to and I can DM and tell them what my issues are and going through the same thing, that online community of disabled people has changed my world. So I'd say turn to social media.
So Ola, earlier you mentioned that your parents are native to Nigeria. I was wondering if you know of any impactful disability justice work either in that nation or across the continent of Africa. I myself have some family and I would love to dig into some resources or just learn if it's not in the region that I'm talking about.
I do have some contacts of people specifically in Nigeria. I will say we have a lot to go. We have a long way to go in parts of West Africa. I believe we have a few blind schools in Nigeria, but beyond that, I know of a support group specifically for disabled queer Nigerians in Nigeria. But I'll have to get back to you. I have your name and I'll be able to send you some of my resources of all groups, you know.
And it looks like we got one more question in the chat. I like how you mentioned we are all temporarily able-bodied to shift the mindset of being able-bodied. Curious, is there anything you may feel comfortable sharing about adjusting to accepting your disability? And that will be the last question.
Oh, okay. Adjusting to accepting my disability. I haven't accepted it. I'm still in denial. And I think that's a lifelong thing for a lot of people who acquire their disability. I think one of the things I had to adjust to was the hypersexualization of disabled women, particularly Black women. As soon as I got my wheelchair, I had I had colleagues who sat me down and told me how different life would be, in terms of you're more of a threat for being targeted for domestic violence. You're more of a threat for being targeted for sexual abuse. I didn't really believe it until I got on the streets of DC and I realized I was being followed by people, followed by men. And so that's one thing I was struggling with my identity, is that now I'm vulnerable to everyone, and a lot of people see me as a target. So I'm gonna put my email in the chat. You guys can reach out anytime. I'm here for anything you guys need, even if it's just mentorship. If you're newly to the disabled community, anything, I'm here.